The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth as Sam, Lena, and their longtime friend Dylan pulled their SUV into the gravel turnout just before sunset. Granite Ridge wasn't a famous campsite. In fact, it wasn't marked on any official park map. Dylan had heard about it from a coworker who swore the place was untouched and perfect for a weekend off the grid. The trailhead was little more than a gap in the underbrush, partially hidden behind a weathered wooden sign that hadn't seen fresh paint in decades. It read Granite Ridge Trail, use at your own risk. They laughed at the ominous wording at first, assuming it was just a way to keep casual hikers away. Still, Lena's gaze lingered on the faded letters longer than the others, her expression caught between intrigue and unease. The path wound sharply upward for the first half-mile, the fading daylight filtering through tall conifers whose branches wove together into a dim canopy. The forest was eerily still. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the trail. Dylan broke the silence with an exaggerated ghost story about a lost prospector who supposedly vanished here in the late 1800s, but his voice seemed swallowed by the trees, as though the woods themselves were absorbing sound. Sam checked his phone for signal. Nothing. It wasn't a surprise, but the blank screen still gave him an odd sense of isolation. They reached the ridge just as the sky turned a deep violet. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills dissolving into a misty horizon, the treetops stretching endlessly in all directions. They chose a small clearing bordered by 3 massive granite boulders, ideal for blocking the wind. As they set up camp, Lena noticed something strange carved into the rock face. Crude, overlapping symbols, some resembling stick figures, others just jagged marks. She called the others over, but Dylan shrugged it off as graffiti left by bored teenagers. Still, Sam traced one of the grooves with his fingers and found it was much deeper than casual vandalism would make. That night, they built a small fire and cooked foil-wrapped meals while the temperature dropped sharply. Dylan kept glancing toward the tree line, where shadows seemed to shift unnaturally under the flickering light. Twice, Lena thought she heard soft movement beyond the fire's reach, but whenever she turned her head, there was nothing. By midnight, a dense fog began creeping in, muffling the crackle of the fire until it felt like they were sitting in a bubble of sound. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and they retreated to their tents, the fire dying to a faint glow. Sometime deep in the night, Sam woke to what he thought was Dylan whispering outside. The voice was low and urgent, speaking words he couldn't make out, except they didn't sound like Dylan's voice at all. It was rougher, older, and had a strange cadence, almost like chanting. He froze, straining to listen, until the voice abruptly stopped. A moment later, he heard footsteps, deliberate and slow, circling the campsite. His breath caught in his throat. Then silence. Sam lay awake until the first gray light of dawn seeped into the tent, the sound of the forest still absent, as if the woods were holding their breath. The morning air was crisp, the fog still clinging stubbornly to the ridge as Lena unzipped her tent. The fire pit was cold, though she swore she'd heard embers crackling not long ago. Sam emerged next, pale and quiet, clearly running on little to no sleep. Dylan, on the other hand, was oddly chipper, humming to himself as he boiled water for instant coffee. When Sam cautiously mentioned the footsteps he'd heard in the night, Dylan's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he brushed it off. "Probably a deer," he said, stirring his cup, though his eyes flickered toward the boulders as if checking for something. After breakfast, Lena insisted they take a closer look at the carvings in daylight. The sunlight revealed far more than they'd seen the evening before. What looked like random symbols now seemed deliberate. Rows of stick-like figures in strange poses, some with circular shapes above their heads, others holding jagged lines that might have been weapons or lightning. Between the figures were marks like tally scratches, but grouped in inconsistent numbers. One section had been polished smooth, as if someone had been repeatedly touching it for years. The grooves weren't fresh, but they also didn't look weathered enough to be centuries old. While Sam and Lena traced the patterns, Dylan wandered further along the ridge. He called out for them to come see something. A few yards from camp, In a shallow hollow between two stones lay a small pile of bones. Not animal, at least not entirely. Some were clearly from small woodland creatures, but mixed among them was what looked disturbingly like a human finger bone, its pale surface catching the morning light. Next to the pile was a rusted tin cup half filled with dark, dried residue. Sam felt the hair rise on his arms, but Dylan just laughed nervously, claiming it was probably some hunter's creepy idea of art. The rest of the day was unsettled. Even when they tried hiking further into the ridge, they kept getting the sense they were walking in circles. The forest floor was littered with fallen needles, so soft that their footsteps made almost no sound, but every so often they'd hear twigs snapping behind them, only to find nothing there. The silence was oppressive, no wind, no birds, until just before dusk, a deep, hollow knock echoed from somewhere far off in the trees. One knock, then a pause, then two more, slower this time, like someone signaling. Dylan muttered, "Woodpecker," but his voice lacked conviction. That night, the fog returned heavier than before, curling between their tents like living things. Sam kept a flashlight in his hand, his ears straining for the voice he'd heard before. Around midnight, it came, but this time it wasn't alone. The rough chanting had returned, joined by a faint rhythmic clapping, slow and deliberate. Sam sat upright in his sleeping bag, heart pounding, while Lena whispered his name from the next tent over. She had heard it too. Neither of them dared to unzip their tents. The chanting grew louder for a few minutes, then stopped abruptly, replaced by that same crushing silence that made the air feel too thick to breathe.
By morning, the fog had thinned, but an oppressive heaviness still clung to the air. Lena's eyes were bloodshot, and Sam looked worse, his jaw tight and shoulders tense. Dylan avoided their gaze, acting as though nothing unusual had happened the night before. He suggested they pack up early and hike deeper into the ridge for better views, but his overly casual tone made it sound like he was trying to steer them away from something. Sam wasn't sure if Dylan was scared or hiding information as they began their hike. Lena kept glancing over her shoulder. She swore she'd seen someone standing between the trees just after they left camp, tall, unmoving, and half concealed by mist. Sam hadn't seen it, but the hair on his arms stood up anyway. The further they walked, the more the forest seemed to rearrange itself. Familiar boulders appeared in places they hadn't passed before. Landmarks repeated, as if the trail itself was folding in on them. At one point, Lena froze mid-step, staring into the undergrowth. "I saw eyes," she whispered, pointing to a dense thicket. Sam scanned it with his flashlight, but the beam seemed to fade unnaturally in the gloom, revealing only shifting shadows. They eventually found themselves in a small clearing that looked disturbingly intentional. No underbrush, just a bare patch of earth in the middle of the woods, ringed with upright stones. The stones bore the same deep carvings as the boulders near camp, but these were arranged in a circle, each facing inward. In the center was a flat slab of granite, its surface stained a deep, rust-brown color. Dylan stepped forward, running his hand over the slab, but quickly pulled back as if it were hot. "It's vibrating," he said in a low voice. Sam placed his palm on it and felt it too, a faint hum, like distant machinery buried deep underground. They decided to turn back, but dusk was already falling. The trail behind them seemed different now, narrower and darker. Every so often, Sam caught movement in the corners of his vision, tall shapes slipping silently between the trees. No matter how quickly he turned his head, they were gone before he could focus. Once, he thought he saw one of the figures crouched low to the ground, its elongated arms resting unnaturally far forward, as though its joints bent the wrong way. When they finally reached the edge of their camp, the fog was already rolling in. This time it came not from the forest floor, but from the treetops, spilling downward like smoke. As night fell, the chanting returned, louder than before, echoing from every direction at once. It was no longer just one or two voices, but many, overlapping in a language none of them understood. Then came the sound of footsteps, dozens of them, moving in a slow circle around the camp. The firelight barely penetrated the fog, but faint silhouettes could be seen moving just beyond the boulders, their heads tilting in unnatural synchrony. The chanting swelled until it seemed to pulse in their chests, each syllable vibrating through the cold night air. Sam gripped his flashlight so tightly his knuckles ached, sweeping the beam across the fog. It caught glimpses of shapes, impossibly tall, thin forms moving in a slow, deliberate circle. Their movements were almost ritualistic, heads tilting in unison, limbs swaying as if to some unheard rhythm. Lena was on her knees by the fire, whispering frantic prayers under her breath. Dylan stood completely still, his eyes wide, but oddly unfocused, like he was listening for something only he could hear. One of the figures stepped closer, just enough of the firelight to catch its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only a smooth, pale surface, featureless except for a vertical slit that opened and closed in slow, deliberate motions. Sam froze as the slit widened briefly, revealing something wet and dark within before closing again. A cold, sweet smell like rotting fruit drifted in on the wind. The figure withdrew into the fog, melting back into the shifting ring of shapes. Without warning, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick, heavy, suffocating. Then from somewhere deep in the fog came 3 sharp knocks, just like they'd heard earlier that day. Another pause. 3 more knocks. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the forest itself was hollow. Dylan stepped toward the noise, muttering under his breath in that same strange cadence they'd heard the first night. Sam grabbed his arm, but Dylan turned, and for an instant his eyes looked wrong, pupils too wide, swallowing nearly all the color. "They're asking," he whispered. "We should answer." Before Sam could respond, something large moved fast between the trees, breaking the circle. The fog surged forward like a living thing, swallowing the fire until the camp was lit only by the harsh, narrow beams of their flashlights. A hand, if it could be called that, slid out of the fog toward Lena, the fingers impossibly long, ending in dark, curved points. She screamed, stumbling back against the boulders, her voice muffled as though the air itself was pressing in. The thing retreated, but only just its outline still visible in the swirling gray. Sam shouted for everyone to get inside their tents, but the moment the zippers closed, the knocking started again. Closer now, right beside them. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. Each time, it came from a different side of the camp, moving faster, until it sounded like they were surrounded by dozens of hands rapping against the stones. Somewhere in that chaos, the chanting began again. This time, only one voice, low and deliberate, speaking from directly outside Sam's tent. The first hint of dawn was just a gray smear in the fog when Sam made the decision. They had to leave now. Whatever was out there wasn't just scaring them, it was playing with them. Lena looked pale and hollow-eyed, her voice shaking as she packed her bag. Dylan moved slowly, almost reluctantly, as if each motion was an afterthought. When Sam pressed him about the chanting, Dylan only muttered, "It's older than here. They've been here longer than the trees." Before going quiet again, they left the camp in silence, flashlights cutting narrow tunnels through the thick fog. The trail they'd hiked in on should have been easy to find, a gap in the undergrowth near the ridge, but every direction now looked the same. The boulders, the pines, the thick carpet of needles, all repeating like they'd stepped into a loop. More than once, they swore they passed the same twisted tree with its lightning-scorched trunk. At one point, Lena dropped a red scarf onto the ground as a marker, only for them to pass it again less than 15 minutes later, still lying in the same place. The fog seemed to grow heavier the further they went, muffling even their footsteps. Then, faintly at first, came the knocks again, not from behind, but ahead. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. Sam stopped, realizing the sound was leading them somewhere, like breadcrumbs in the mist. Dylan's breathing quickened. He started following the knocks without hesitation, forcing Sam to grab his arm. But Dylan's strength was surprising, unnatural, as he wrenched free, muttering, "You can't leave without giving them something." Moments later, they stumbled into another clearing, smaller than the stone circle from before, but equally unsettling. At its center was a crude wooden structure, about waist-high, draped in strips of weathered cloth and decorated with bones, feathers, and small stone carvings of those same faceless figures. The fog clung thick around it, and Sam felt a deep, instinctive urge not to step closer. But Dylan was already kneeling in front of it, whispering. His words were too low to make out, but Lena grabbed Sam's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "He's not talking to us," she whispered. The forest seemed to listen. Every branch, every leaf was still waiting. Then the knocks came again, deafeningly loud this time, from every direction at once. Sam reached for Dylan, but something moved in the fog. Not one figure this time, but several, closing in. The shapes didn't walk so much as glide, their elongated limbs swaying in slow rhythm. One of them tilted its head toward Dylan, and then toward the wooden structure, as if waiting for him to finish. Sam didn't know what the offering was supposed to be, but he knew one thing. If they stayed here, they wouldn't see another sunrise. Sam lunged forward, grabbing Dylan by the shoulder and yanking him away from the wooden shrine. Dylan resisted with surprising force, his voice rising into that guttural, rhythmic cadence they'd heard for 2 nights now. The figures in the fog swayed in perfect unison, as though his words were controlling them. Lena shouted for Sam to run, her voice high and raw with panic. The moment Dylan's chanting broke, the nearest figure moved, a sudden, gliding step forward that brought it far too close. The fog around its body pulsed, and the faint smell of rotting fruit filled the air again. They ran. The knocks followed, louder now, faster, overlapping until it became a constant pounding like hundreds of fists striking hollow wood. The fog surged with them, curling low along the ground like it was chasing at their heels. Branches whipped across their faces, and the forest floor seemed to tilt beneath their feet. The trees blurred together into streaks of black and gray, until Sam's sense of direction collapsed completely. Every breath burned. Every step felt heavier than the last. Suddenly, Lena screamed. Sam spun to see her tangled in something. Not branches, but a net of woven grass and sinew, strung between 2 trees. It hadn't been there moments ago. She thrashed wildly, the cords tightening around her wrists and ankles. Sam drew his knife and hacked at the fibers, but they were damp, slick, and stronger than they should have been. From the fog, one of the figures appeared, gliding closer with that same unnerving tilt of the head, watching silently. Its limbs hung too long, the hands reaching almost to the ground. Dylan appeared behind them, his expression blank. "They just want one of us," he said calmly, as if explaining something obvious. "Then the others can go." The figure's head turned toward Dylan, as if acknowledging his words. Sam's mind raced. Was Dylan telling the truth, or was this another trick? Lena's breathing was shallow now, panic and exhaustion making her movements clumsy. The figure extended a hand toward her, the claws catching faint light. Sam made his choice. With a roar, he slashed through the last of the cords holding Lena, grabbing her wrist and dragging her free. The figure paused, tilting its head further, almost in curiosity. Then, with a jerking, insect-like movement, it stepped back into the fog and was gone. The knocking stopped all at once, replaced by a silence so sudden it rang in their ears. Sam didn't know if they'd escaped or if the forest was simply letting them go for now. But deep down, he knew this wasn't over. They moved fast, not daring to speak, only the sound of their ragged breathing cutting through the quiet. The fog clung low, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Sam led the way, using his compass even though the needle jittered unnaturally, as if it was struggling to decide where north was. Lena followed close behind, still trembling from her near capture. Dylan brought up the rear, silent now, his face unreadable in the dim light. The ridge path should have sloped downward by now, toward the gravel turnout, toward safety, but instead, it kept winding upward, deeper into the trees. Each bend revealed another stretch of trail identical to the last, with the same moss-covered boulders and the same twisted roots snaking across the path. Sam tried marking trees with his knife, but within minutes, the same markings appeared on trees far ahead of them, as if they'd walked in a loop they couldn't see. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Eventually, the trail opened into another clearing, one Sam swore they hadn't passed before. At its center was a massive, split tree, hollow at the base, the inside blackened as though burned from within. Around its roots were arranged small stone cairns, dozens of them, each topped with a smooth river rock marked by the same crude stick figure carvings. Some had been stacked so recently that bits of damp soil still clung to them. The place radiated a quiet wrongness that made Sam's skin crawl. Then, without warning, the knocks started again. This time they came from inside the hollow tree, deep and resonant, like something large striking from within. The fog thickened instantly, and shapes began to appear in the tree lean. Not moving this time, just standing. Dozens of them. The longer Sam looked, the more detail he saw: shoulders that were too narrow, necks too long, arms swaying slightly, as if in a breeze the others couldn't feel. One by one, their heads turned toward the group in perfect synchrony. Lena's voice was barely a whisper. "It's not letting us leave." Sam wanted to argue, but the truth sat heavy in his gut. This wasn't just a place they were lost in. It was something that wanted them to stay. Whether for hours or years didn't matter. The ridge had closed its grip, and somewhere deep in the fog, that low, rough chanting began again, wrapping around them like a net. The chanting grew louder, no longer distant, but curling close around them, as if the fog itself were carrying the voices. Dylan stepped forward toward the split tree, his shoulders squared, his expression strangely calm. "This is where it happens," he said softly, almost to himself. Lena grabbed his arm, but he shook her off without looking at her. Sam noticed the cairns around the tree seemed different now. Some of the river rocks no longer had carvings, just blank, smooth surfaces, as though the marks had been erased, and a deep thud echoed from inside the hollow, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Then another, slower, more deliberate. The figures in the tree lean swayed in unison, their long arms stretching toward the ground. One of them stepped forward, impossibly tall in the fog, and raised an elongated hand toward Dylan. It didn't speak, but somehow Sam understood. This was an invitation, or a demand. Dylan turned to them, his voice low and certain. "It's me or all of us. That's how it works. I've seen it, felt it." Sam didn't know whether to believe him, but Lena's grip tightened on his arm, her nails digging into his skin. The fog shifted, curling inward until it felt like they were trapped inside a shrinking room. The air was heavy, thick with that sweet rot smell. Somewhere above, the treetops whispered though there was no wind. Sam's instinct screamed to run, but every direction looked the same. A pale wall of mist and the vague outlines of motionless watchers. Dylan took a step toward the hollow, and the knocks stopped instantly, replaced by silence so deep it pressed against their eardrums. The figure in front of him tilted its head, that vertical slit in its face opening slightly. Then Dylan smiled, a small, almost relieved expression, and stepped fully into the hollow of the tree. The fog surged forward like a living thing, swallowing him whole. The figures began to recede into the mist, their forms stretching and thinning until they were gone. The cairns around the tree shifted subtly, the tops of some now bearing fresh carvings that hadn't been there seconds ago. The fog began to thin almost immediately after Dylan disappeared into the hollow. It wasn't sudden, but gradual, like steam dissipating from cooling water. The tree lean opened ahead of them, revealing a faint trail neither of them remembered seeing before. The air felt lighter, though the smell of rotting fruit still clung faintly to their clothes. Sam and Lena exchanged a look. Neither spoke Dylan's name. There was a shared, unspoken understanding that whatever had happened to him wasn't meant to be retrieved. They followed the trail in silence, every step cautious. The forest was different now. Sounds had returned. A distant bird call, the faint rustle of leaves overhead. It should have been comforting, but it felt wrong, like the forest was pretending to be normal. Sam couldn't shake the sensation that they were being escorted rather than allowed to leave. More than once, he thought he saw a pale shape far back in the trees, keeping pace but never approaching. After what felt like hours, They broke through the last line of trees and found themselves back at the gravel turnout. Their SUV sat exactly as they'd left it, except for one detail. On the hood lay a smooth river rock, freshly wet as if pulled from a stream. It bore a single crude carving of 3 stick figures. One figure stood apart from the other two. The carving was shallow, but Sam could feel the grooves under his fingertips, warm despite the morning chill. Lena wanted to drive immediately, but Sam lingered a moment, scanning the tree-line. The fog was gone now, but the forest beyond Granite Ridge still looked unnaturally dark, like the shadows that were heavier than they should be. Just before he turned away, he thought he saw movement, a tall, thin shape standing between the pines, watching them. The moment he blinked, it was gone. They drove in silence for miles, the trees finally thinning into open road. But the smell of rotting fruit never left the car, no matter how far they got from the ridge. For the first 2 days after leaving Granite Ridge, Sam and Lena barely spoke. The road stretched endlessly, motels blending together, meals left half-eaten. They told themselves the silence was mutual exhaustion, but both knew it was fear, as if talking about what happened would call it back. At night, Sam woke often, certain he'd heard slow knocking somewhere in the room. Lena admitted she'd been sleeping with the lights on. Neither dared to mention Dylan.by the third night. They were back in their own town. Sam dropped Lena off at her apartment and drove home, feeling an almost physical relief at the familiar streets. But when he unlocked his front door, the air inside was cool and faintly sweet, carrying that same subtle rot he'd been trying to forget. His stomach knotted, and he told himself it was nothing, maybe a leftover piece of fruit gone bad. He tossed his duffel bag onto the couch, and something inside shifted with a soft clink. He unzipped it and froze. At the bottom was another smooth river rock, damp and cold, the carving shallow but fresh. 2 stick figures. The third one was gone. His hands shook as he set it down on the coffee table, staring at it like it might move. A faint memory rose, unbidden, Dylan's voice saying, "They've been here longer than the trees." Sam wondered if they'd really left the ridge, or if the ridge had come with them. That night, he dreamed of the fog. Not the kind that rolled in naturally, but the thick, curling mist that seemed to think. In the dream, he stood at the edge of the hollow tree, the cairns stretching farther than he could see. Somewhere in that endless expanse, Dylan's voice was chanting. Slower now, but steady, almost patient. Sam woke with the taste of damp earth in his mouth and the sound of 3 knocks still echoing in his head. The next morning, the river rock was gone. In its place sat a small, dark tin cup, the inside glistening faintly in the sunlight.